He goose-stepped across wrestling rings for 3 decades. He raised one massive hand into the air, fingers curled like talons, and entire arenas screamed for his blood. Television networks were so disturbed by his finishing move that they covered it with a giant red X, censoring it right there on the broadcast, as if the sight of it was too dangerous for the public to witness. Fans threw chairs at him and chased him to the parking lot, screaming for him to go back to Germany. There was just one problem with all of that. He wasn't from Germany. He had never set foot in Germany. He couldn't speak a word of actual German. He was a soft-spoken, bespectacled, deeply polite schoolteacher from Omaha, Nebraska, who once qualified for the Olympics, married his sweetheart for life, and was so gentle that his own son had to warn a visiting playwright not to swear around the house. This is the story of how a shy amateur wrestler with a receding hairline and a science teaching degree transformed himself into one of the most hated, most feared, and ultimately most beloved villains in the history of professional wrestling. The story of the man behind the claw. And by the end, you'll understand why. Decades after he threw his last claw, fans still speak his name with a mixture of terror and genuine love. But to understand any of it, you have to start where he started. Not with the Baron. With a kid named Jim. James Donald Raschke was born on October 17, 1940 in Omaha, Nebraska. The middle child of 3 boys, growing up in a hard-working, no-nonsense Midwestern household where you were expected to be humble, work hard, and keep your head down. There was nothing about young Jim Raschke that suggested he would one day be one of the most reviled men in America. He was, by his own admission, painfully shy. Reticent, backwards, as he would later describe himself. Meeting new people terrified him. Speaking up terrified him. He was a quiet kid who blended into the background and preferred it that way. He idolized his older brother, a tall, lean, natural athlete who played football and basketball and ran track and made it all look effortless. Jim wanted to be just like him, so in high school he went out for football and did okay, in his own modest words. Then he went out for basketball and discovered a hard truth. He couldn't dribble, he couldn't shoot. He was, as he put it, short and stubby, nothing like his graceful brother, and he got cut from the team. But then he wandered over to talk to the wrestling coach, who told him it was too late to join that year. "Come back next year," the coach said, and Jim Raschke came back. And when he stepped onto that wrestling mat, everything changed. Because the short, stubby, shy kid who couldn't dribble a basketball had found the one sport built for exactly his kind of body and his quiet, relentless determination. Wrestling doesn't care if you're graceful or outgoing. It rewards leverage, strength, and the willingness to grind an opponent down through sheer stubborn will. And Jim Raschke had all of that in abundance. He became a Nebraska State high school champion, and that was only the beginning. He enrolled at the University of Nebraska and became a genuine standout, a 3-year letterman on the Cornhuskers wrestling team through the early 1960s, so physically gifted that he also played football as a left tackle. But wrestling was his true calling. In 1962, he captured the Big 8 Conference Heavyweight Championship, and then he did something almost nobody remembers about the future Baron. He became one of the best amateur wrestlers in the world. In 1963, Jim Raschke traveled to the World Championships and won a bronze medal in Greco-Roman wrestling. This wasn't a character or a scripted performance. This was a real athletic achievement against the best amateur wrestlers on the planet. One of only a handful of Americans to ever place at that level in Greco-Roman competition. The next year, in 1964, he qualified for the United States Olympic team, earning his spot at the Tokyo Games, and then his body betrayed him. An injury struck at the worst possible moment, and Raschke was unable to compete at the Olympics he had worked his entire life to reach. The dream he had sacrificed so much for slipped through his fingers because of an injury he couldn't control. Around this same period, he served a stint in the United States Army, winning the Worldwide Inter-Service Wrestling Championship in 1965. And through all of it, he was pursuing what he thought would be his real career, studying to become a science teacher. That was who Jim Raschke was supposed to become. But wrestling wasn't done with him yet. A legendary name was about to enter his life. Werner Gagne. The former Olympic wrestler turned promoter, owner of the American Wrestling Association, had a reputation for recruiting legitimate amateur wrestlers and turning them into professional stars. And when he came through Omaha for a show, he crossed paths with Jim Raschke. He saw the amateur credentials, the size, the strength, the legitimate background, and he asked Raschke to come to Minnesota. So in 1966, Raschke made the leap. He moved to the Minneapolis area and began learning the professional side of the business, training under Gagne and his staff, including the veteran Wally Carbo, absorbing the countless details that separate a real amateur wrestler from a professional entertainer. The choreography, the psychology, the art of telling a story with your body while an entire arena watches. He started at the very bottom, working as a referee at first, and one of his humble early jobs was setting up the ring for the weekly television tapings at the Calhoun Beach Club in Minneapolis. Every Saturday, he would build the ring, then climb into a control booth and study how the veterans did their work. He wrestled his first professional matches under his own name, Jim Raschke from Nebraska, presented as the local amateur hero he actually was. And it was a start, but there was nothing that suggested this quiet, shy former Olympic hopeful was about to become a legend. And then came the single sentence that created a monster. It happened in that same control booth. Raschke was up there one Saturday when a man he had never met poked his head into the room, looked him over, took in the shaved close hair, the hard features, the imposing frame. And then he said 7 words that would echo through the rest of Jim Raschke's life. "You'd make a good German." That stranger was Maurice Vachon, better known to wrestling fans everywhere as Mad Dog Vachon, one of the most feared performers in the business. A wild-eyed brawler with a reputation for absolute chaos. And he had just looked at a shy schoolteacher and seen a menacing German villain hiding underneath. The two struck up a friendship, and soon Vachon made Raschke an offer that would change everything. "Why don't you come up to Canada and be my partner?" To Raschke, still a nobody in the wrestling world, this was an enormous honor. One of the biggest stars in the business was asking him to be a tag team partner. He couldn't say no, so he committed fully. His hairline was receding anyway, so he shaved his head completely bald. He had already married Bonnie, the love of his life, so the two packed up and headed north. And there, in front of French-speaking crowds who didn't understand English well enough to catch the cracks in his performance, a shy man from Omaha became the Baron von Raschke. Canada turned out to be the perfect laboratory for building a character. Jim Raschke had spent his entire life terrified of speaking up, but now he was pretending to be someone else entirely, cutting interviews in a thick, invented German accent, playing a mad Teutonic terror. And because most of the audience couldn't fully understand him, the pressure was off. They knew he talked funny. They didn't know exactly how. There was no risk of embarrassment. It was, in his own words, the perfect place to perfect the character. And he did. Almost immediately, he found himself at ease inhabiting the monster. Comfortable as a person he was not. The shyness melted away because it wasn't Jim Raschke standing in that ring anymore. It was the Baron. And the Baron was afraid of nothing. Years later, he would say something haunting and a little bit funny all at once. Maybe the Baron was the real him. He didn't really know. The character came together piece by piece. The shaved head gave him the look of a cold, menacing officer, and some thought he resembled the actor Yul Brynner. He goose-stepped around the ring. That stiff-legged military march that instantly conjured a dark and infamous chapter of history. He roared and scowled and swaggered. Every element was designed to make American and Canadian audiences, many of whom had lived through the Second World War, absolutely despise him. And they did. Early on, his finishing maneuver was the Prussian sleeper, paired with a chilling mantra he would bark out to the crowd. "I am ordered to win. I must win. And I will win." It was cold and militaristic, everything the audiences of that era had been taught to fear. But it was the next evolution of his finisher that would truly cement his legend. The claw. The move was deceptively simple. He would clamp one enormous hand onto his opponent's skull or midsection, fingers digging in like talons, and squeeze. His victims would writhe and scream until they either submitted or passed out. In his own explanation, the claw was a nerve hold, one he described with characteristic dry humor as causing pain to run all the way up the medulla oblongata. He also admitted, with a wink, that it was more of a show hold than a real one, something that looked utterly devastating but was, above all, spectacular theater. Once that big hand was clamped down and his opponent was thrashing in torment, there was nothing else in wrestling quite like it. The claw became his signature. When the Baron raised that hand into the air, curled his fingers and stalked toward a fallen opponent, arenas came unglued, hating him with a passion almost impossible to describe today. This was a different era. The fans didn't treat wrestling as scripted entertainment. Many believed, or wanted to believe, that what they were seeing was real. And so when a bald, goose-stepping German villain tortured their beloved local hero with a screaming nerve hold, they didn't politely applaud. They wanted to kill him. They threw things at him. Getting back to the locker room could be a genuine ordeal. A gauntlet of furious spectators, and he and Mad Dog Vachon often had to physically fight their way out after their matches. The danger of an enraged crowd was completely real. There is a dark irony here. The most gentle, soft-spoken man you could ever hope to meet had become so convincing as a monster that people genuinely wanted to hurt him. He had taken his crippling shyness, hidden it inside a character, and turned it into his greatest strength. Behind the accent and the scowl, the real Jim Raschke was free. As the character grew, so did his catchphrase, born entirely by accident in the most Jim Raschke way imaginable. He was doing a television interview back in the Twin Cities with the veteran AWA announcer Marty O'Neill. The promos were usually about 2 minutes long. Raschke said everything he had planned, stretched it out as long as he could, and figured he was done. He started to walk away. And then O'Neill called out to him, "Wait a minute, Baron," and he hit him with one more question, completely off guard. Raschke had nothing, no answer prepared, so he looked at O'Neill, then looked directly into the camera and snarled out the first thing that came into his head. "That is all the people need to know." And then he stormed off in a rage. O'Neill thought it was the funniest, most perfect thing he had ever seen, and insisted they get the Baron to do it again. So Raschke said it again, and the time after that. Within about 2 weeks, the fans demanded it. "That is all the people need to know" had become the Baron's signature sign-off. A line fans would repeat for decades, born from nothing more than a shy man getting caught without an answer and improvising his way out of it. That was the genius of Jim Raschke, hidden inside the Baron. Later in life, a playwright who worked closely with him marveled that Raschke had the stage instincts of British actors with 2 centuries of tradition behind them, an intuitive sense for exactly when to give a certain look and how to read a crowd of thousands. Instincts, he said, you only get from working in front of enormous live crowds. Armed with his shaved head, his goose step, his accent, and now his claw, the Baron von Raschke set out to conquer the territorial wrestling world. And conquer it he did. This was the golden age of the territory system, when professional wrestling was carved up into dozens of regional promotions across North America. A villain as effective as the Baron was pure gold, because he could travel from territory to territory, drawing furious crowds, feuding with the top local hero before moving on to the next town and doing it all over again. And so the Baron became a nomad of menace, terrorizing audiences across the continent throughout the 1970s and into the early 1980s. He held championships almost everywhere he went, singles and tag team titles across the National Wrestling Alliance and American Wrestling Association territories, brass knuckles titles in Texas, regional heavyweight and television championships. In the Mid-Atlantic region, one of the most respected territories in the country, he won the NWA World Tag Team Championship on multiple occasions, teaming with partners including the future legend Greg Valentine and his old friend Paul Jones. Wherever there was a top hero for fans to rally behind, the Baron was the monster that Hero had to slay. And then there was his run in the Northeast, in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, the promotion that would one day become the global juggernaut we know today. It was there, in front of the massive crowds of the New York territory, that the Baron achieved one of the most remarkable distinctions of his entire career. His claw hold was so disturbing that the television broadcasts censored it. When the Baron locked it in, the promotion would superimpose an enormous red X over the image, blotting out the move entirely, as if the sight of it was too dangerous for the audience at home to see. In an era before the ultra-violence that would later become common, a simple hand clamped onto a skull was deemed so shocking that it had to be hidden from view. He had made a nerve hold into something networks felt they had to protect the public from. Managed during this run by the legendary loudmouth classy Freddie Blassie, the Baron climbed toward the top of the mountain. And in March of 1977, he reached the summit, challenging Bruno Sammartino, the living legend, the most beloved champion in the promotion's history, for the World Heavyweight Championship at Madison Square Garden. The hated German villain against the pride of an entire immigrant community, the hero of working people across the Northeast. The Baron even managed to lock his dreaded claw onto the champion's head, but it ended in controversy, as so many of these epic matches did. With Sammartino tangled in the ropes and the claw applied, the Baron shoved the referee away and the disqualification was called. He lost, but in a way that protected his menace and guaranteed fans would pay to see the rematch. And pay they did. The two met again at the Garden the following month, and Sammartino defeated the Baron cleanly in what turned out to be historically significant. It was Bruno's last successful title defense before he dropped the championship to superstar Billy Graham. A bald schoolteacher from Nebraska, pretending to be a German aristocrat, had stood across the ring from one of the greatest champions in history, in the most famous building in the sport, as a genuine main event threat. That is how far the character had taken him. In 1978, when the Mid-Atlantic television title was elevated and renamed, the Baron von Raschke was recognized as the very first NWA television champion, the inaugural holder of a championship with a long and storied history. First, that word belongs to him. Through it all, there was a duality that defined his existence. The moment he stepped out of the arena, the Baron disappeared and Jim Raschke returned. And Jim Raschke just wanted a quiet, decent life. The stories about his private character are almost impossible to reconcile with the monster he played. By every account from everyone who ever knew him, he was one of the kindest, most soft-spoken gentlemen in the entire wrestling business. When he wasn't on the road terrorizing crowds, he worked as a substitute teacher, standing calmly in front of classrooms full of children. He and Bonnie built a lasting marriage that would endure for over half a century. Being a famous villain in real life could be strange. Because so many people believed the character was real, strangers would approach him talking in a crude, aggressive way, assuming that was how a wrestler like him must behave. And there would be a brief flicker across his face, a quiet, "No, that's not me." He was never that man, he just played him on television. He even tried wearing a wig once to disguise his famous bald head, but it backfired completely. As Bonnie would later joke, the wig was so unconvincing that everybody recognized him the moment he put it on. He was better off just wearing his glasses and being himself. His own son once gave the clearest picture of who the family really was. When the playwright who would eventually write about the Baron's life first came to meet them, Karl Raschke pulled him aside with a gentle warning. "Listen," he said, "don't swear, okay? My parents really don't like that." The monster of the arena was, at his kitchen table, a soft-spoken dad who didn't like cursing. That impossible gap between the snarling German villain and the humble Nebraska gentleman is the entire heart of who Baron von Raschke was. And it would eventually become the subject of an entire play and film, as people tried to make sense of how one man could contain both. As the 1980s arrived, the Baron entered one of the most beloved chapters of his career, and it came in the place where it had all begun. Back home, in the American Wrestling Association, in front of the Minnesota crowds who knew him best. In May of 1984, the Baron teamed with one of the most adored figures in Midwestern wrestling history, the barrel-chested, gravel-voiced brawler known as the Crusher. Together, this unlikely duo defeated Jerry Blackwell and Ken Patera to capture the AWA World Tag Team Championship, a genuine highlight of his AWA years. They held those titles until August, when they dropped them to the face-painted juggernauts known as the Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal, who were revolutionizing the entire concept of a tag team at that very moment. But something more interesting than a title reign was happening to the Baron in the AWA. The fans were starting to love him. It's one of the strangest phenomena in professional wrestling. When a villain performs at a high enough level for long enough, week after week, year after year, the hatred curdles into a strange kind of affection. The boos slowly turn into cheers. And that is exactly what happened to the Baron. The turning point came through loyalty. His old friend and mentor, Mad Dog Vachon, the man who had discovered him and given him his name, had been injured. And the Baron turned to the side of the fans to avenge him, standing up as a hero against the villains who had hurt his friend. The crowds who had once wanted to tear him limb from limb now roared their approval. The claw, once a symbol of terror, became a beloved crowd pleaser. The hated German villain had become a folk hero of the American heartland. And there was something fitting about it, because the fans, whether they knew it or not, were finally cheering for the real man, the gentle, loyal person who had been hiding inside the monster all along. In 1986, the Baron ventured back into the National Wrestling Alliance, joining Jim Crockett Promotions, the flagship territory that would soon become the foundation of a national wrestling empire. There, he reunited with his old tag partner Paul Jones, now a manager leading a stable of villains known as Paul Jones' Army, and even helped hold the NWA World Six-Man Tag Team Championship alongside the Russian villains Ivan and Nikita Koloff when their regular partner was injured. But the Baron couldn't stay a villain anymore. The fans wouldn't let him. He turned against Paul Jones and became a fan favorite once again, teaming with Hector Guerrero at the prestigious Starrcade event in 1986 to defeat members of the very army he had just abandoned. After teaming with Wahoo McDaniel at the Crockett Cup in 1987, the Baron's run in the NWA came to an end. There was a brief, curious chapter in 1988 when the Baron returned to the World Wrestling Federation in the middle of its explosive national expansion. But this time, he wasn't there to wrestle. He was brought in as a manager for the monstrous tag team known as the Powers of Pain, the Barbarian and the Warlord, under the simple name of the Baron. It didn't last. He was released shortly after arriving, the stint ending almost before it began. But the Baron wasn't finished. He returned once again to the AWA, the promotion that had always been his true home, feuding with villains like Soldat Ustinov and Tejo Khan into the late 1980s. As the once mighty company entered its final struggling years, he captained a team called Baron's Blitzers in a doomed concept called the Team Challenge Series, a last-ditch effort to keep it afloat. When the AWA finally collapsed, the Baron did what he had always done. He kept going, wrestling for independent promotions around his beloved Minnesota, performing for the loyal fans who had grown up watching him and now brought their own children to see the legendary Claw one more time. In 1993, World Championship Wrestling brought him back for its inaugural Slamboree, a Legends reunion celebrating the veterans who had built the business. The Baron teamed with his old comrade Ivan Koloff, a chance for a new national audience to see the icon in action once more. His long in-ring journey came to its end in the mid-1990s. His last recorded match was a victory over an opponent named David Lynch at a Superstars of Wrestling event in Princeton, West Virginia on February 10, 1996. After 3 decades of goose-stepping and clawing his way from the control booth at the Calhoun Beach Club to Madison Square Garden and back to the small halls of the independent circuit, the Baron von Raschke stepped out of the ring for the final time. And here is where the story of the man becomes, in some ways, even more remarkable than the story of the character. Because a lifetime of professional wrestling had extracted a heavy physical toll, and the claw itself had done real damage to his own body, he would catalogue the wreckage with his usual dry wit. Both shoulders surgically rebuilt, 3 knee surgeries and full replacements of both knees, carpal tunnel surgery on both wrists, a crushed bone removed from one wrist entirely. When asked, half joking, whether it was the claw that had wrecked his wrist, he answered honestly, actually it was. He had simply kept doing it anyway, night after night, because the fans wanted the claw. But unlike so many wrestlers of his generation whose lives spiraled into tragedy after the cheering stopped, Jim Raschke landed softly, because he had never actually needed the character to be whole. The Baron was a costume he could take off. Underneath was a stable, happy man with a loving wife, a family, and a quiet set of values that had never wavered. He went back to teaching. He and Bonnie bought and ran a little souvenir and gift shop called the Wigwam in Lake George, Minnesota, an ordinary business for a man who had spent his career being anything but ordinary. They ran it together until selling it in the year 2000. The most hated man in wrestling, spending his retirement selling trinkets to tourists alongside his wife. It's almost too perfect. And then, in a wonderful twist, the world of art came calling for the Baron's remarkable story. In April of 2007, a stage play opened at the Minnesota History Theater in St. Paul. It was called simply The Baron, co-written by Raschke's own son Carl, along with a playwright named Corey McLeod, and Raschke himself narrated and starred in it. It ran for months, drawing audiences who came to explore that impossible contrast at the center of his life. Working on that play, McLeod was struck by something profound. Wrestlers, he found, were natural storytellers. But Jim Raschke was special because the distance between his everyday self and his character was enormous. Some performers, like Mad Dog Vachon, essentially became their characters permanently. Vachon stopped being Morris a long time ago, McLeod observed, but Jim Raschke had kept the two completely separate. He could summon the Baron at will, then set him down and walk away as the humble schoolteacher, entirely himself. The play became the foundation for something even bigger. A feature documentary about Raschke's life, titled The Claw, again written by his son Carl, and directed by the acclaimed music video director Phil Harder, who had first met Raschke years earlier when he hired the wrestler for a video for a Duluth indie rock band. The film took nearly a decade to complete, weaving the wrestling footage together with the music of the Minneapolis punk scene, drawing a fascinating connection between the theatrical menace of old-school villains like the Baron, the Crusher, and Mad Dog, and the confrontational energy of the punk rockers who had grown up watching them. It even brought in Raschke's own daughter to tell what it was actually like to grow up as the child of a famous villain. The Claw premiered in 2021, and critics hailed it as wildly entertaining, a fitting celebration of one of wrestling's most unusual and endearing figures. The honors kept coming, Hall of Fame after Hall of Fame, the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, the George Tragos and Lou Thesz Hall of Fame, dedicated to wrestlers with legitimate amateur backgrounds, a perfect fit for the former Olympic qualifier, the St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame, and back home, the Nebraska Scholastic Wrestling Coaches Association Hall of Fame, honoring the amateur career that had started it all. And even in his 80s, the Baron would not fully disappear. In November of 2021, at an all-elite wrestling pay-per-view called Full Gear, the crowd got a joyful surprise. There, at ringside during a chaotic brawl, was the Baron von Raschke himself. And when the moment was right, the old villain rose up, raised that famous hand, curled his fingers into the shape once covered by a giant red X on television, and clamped the claw onto an unsuspecting wrestler one more time. A new generation of fans, most of whom had never seen him wrestle, roared with delight. The legend was real, and still capable of thrilling a crowd with a single iconic gesture. That is the enduring magic of Baron von Raschke. He built his legend on a lie, a fake German accent, a fake nationality, a fake villainy, and yet the thing underneath was completely real. The loyalty was real. The kindness was real. The love between him and Bonnie was real. The talent was entirely his own. He took the shyness that had nearly kept him from any athletic career and channeled it into a character so bold that networks censored him. He took an Olympic dream shattered by injury and redirected it into a 30-year odyssey that made him beloved from Minneapolis to Madison Square Garden. He played the most hated man in the building night after night, then went home to a house where his children asked visitors not to swear because their gentle father didn't care for it. And perhaps that contradiction is why people remember him so clearly. Wrestling has produced bigger stars, louder personalities, and more elaborate characters. But very few men ever disappeared into a role quite like Raschke did. The moment he stepped through the curtain, Jim Raschke seemed to vanish. In his place stood the wild-eyed Baron, barking threats, twisting his face into impossible expressions, and raising that hand for the claw. For a few minutes, the audience believed every second of it. Then the bell rang. The lights went down, and the monster quietly became a husband and father again. There's a lesson buried in the story of the man behind the claw, something about how the roles we play are not always who we are, how a person can spend a life pretending to be a monster and remain underneath one of the kindest people anyone ever met. Fans wanted to kill him for 30 years, and decades later those same fans, their children, and their grandchildren still light up at the sight of that raised hand and those curled fingers, chanting a catchphrase a shy man invented by accident, telling the stories of the bald German who was really just Jim from Omaha. The Baron von Raschke terrified the wrestling world, and then he won its heart. Not bad for a short, stubby kid who got cut from the basketball team, who found the one mat in the world built for exactly who he was, and rode it all the way to legend. And that, as the man himself would say, is all the people need to know. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries, and I will see you on the next one.